Hey, before I get started today, I wanted to mention a little side project I have completely outside of Time Ghost. Now, as some of you know, I do a lot of research into baseball history. And so a few weeks ago, my pal Burns and I started a podcast, not a video, just audio, called Indy Neidell's Baseball History Time Machine. It is super nerdy and with loads of great old stories and loads of stats. And it's at Apple Podcasts, Amazon, Spotify, a bunch of places where you listen to podcasts. So, Indy Neidell's Baseball History Time Machine, check it out. Okay, May 6th, 1951. Douglas MacArthur was fired for repeated insubordination to U.S. President Harry Truman. And then some. But he has returned to the States as a huge hero. But what really happened? The people want to know. And so this week in the Senate, the MacArthur hearings begin. I'm Indy Neidell, and this is the Korean War. Last week was a week of solid, non-stop action as the Chinese Spring Offensive smashed into the UN lines on all fronts. In fact, I did not cover all the events of last week, and left off midweek when the UN forces had withdrawn to the Delta Line. They are not planning on heavily defending or fortifying this line, though. U.S. First Corps Commander Frank Milburn sees this as a phase line for eventual withdrawal to the Golden Line. He planned to mark out additional phase lines between Delta and Golden, so that in each step of the withdrawal, displacing artillery units would remain within range of the line being vacated and could provide continuous support to infantry units as they withdrew. Each move to the rear was to be made in daylight, so that any enemy forces following the withdrawal could be hit most effectively with artillery fire and airstrikes. It's already the 26th that Milburn orders the next withdrawal after heavy attacks the night before by North Korean First Corps and Chinese 19th Army Group. This position is 4 to 8 kilometers below the Delta Line and kind of centers on Uijeongbu, though north of it. Just a heads up here, this episode has an awful lot of deployments and redeployments. Anyhow, with First Corps withdrawing, 9th Corps Commander William Hogue orders his corps, on First Corps' right, to also withdraw to tie in with their new positions. Now, we saw the Canadians and Australians holding the hill masses north of Kapyong. Their fight there was actually the final act of the 27th Commonwealth Brigade. The Argyll and Middlesex regiments have been relieved and the brigade disbanded, but it has been replaced by a reconstituted 28th Commonwealth Brigade. You will hear more about them soon enough. They are to reoccupy those hill masses. U.S. 1st Marine Division is to pull back to positions in the northern outskirts of Choncheon and along the Soyang River. Doing that, though, will leave U.S. 10th Corps' flank open. So 10th Corps Commander Ned Allman has to pull 2nd and 7th Divisions back from the Hwachon Reservoir area. So their line will run northeast from the Soyang to just below Yanggu, and then southeast from there to the ROK, South Korean, 5th Division position below Inje. There is this, though. Although the First Corps withdrawal, and thus the chain reaction eastward, was prompted by the heavy enemy pressure in the Corps' western sector, there was evidence by the 26th of April that the main effort of the enemy offensive was beginning to falter. In fact, they estimate that on the First Corps front, counting infantry, artillery, and air attacks, they've taken out 48,000 of the enemy. If accurate, that is 5 divisions. They also figure that the stand of the Gloucesters against PVA, Chinese 63rd Army last week, wrecked the general timetable of the enemy advance, specifically that of 19th Army Group in the west. The U.S. 8th Army Commander James Van Fleet comes up with another defense line over there, one further back, that uses the fortifications of the Golden Line above the outskirts of Seoul. This continues east like 10 kilometers above where the Pukhan River meets the Han River, then like 15 kilometers below Choncheon, and like 25 south of India, then to the east coast above Yangyang. Tight coordination between all corps is required for withdrawals to these positions, and the timing will be based on First Corps and the enemy pressure on that front. Van Fleet does not, unusually, give this line a name, so it becomes known as No Name Line. He is worried that the enemy might cross the Han estuary and head down the Kimpo Peninsula, which would take Kimpo Airfield, Incheon, and the Seoul airport. So he has Naval Task Force 95 watching the estuary with planes from the carriers, and Cruiser Toledo heads over from Japan to provide bombardment support. That turns out to be a good idea. The night of the 26th, all of 1st Corps except 24th Division comes under attack. In 25th Division sector, the Chinese attack the 27th Infantry and break through over a kilometer, but flares from a flare ship give light for massive ground fire, and a radar-directed bomb strike is called in, and this wrecks the Chinese. The hardest attacks this night are against ROK 1st Division and 65th Infantry from US 3rd Division. Airstrikes and artillery stop the Chinese facing 65th Infantry. The Chinese do push ROK 1st Division back a few kilometers, but they are then able to contain the advance. And North Koreans attacking down Route 1 also make some ground before they too are contained. Not long after dawn the 27th, Milburn orders his corps to the next phase line, the last one they will occupy before reaching the Golden Line. This goes from below the River Han, but above Kimpo Airfield, then goes to across Route 3 south of Uijeongbu. Hogue orders the left of 9th Corps to also withdraw. 24th Division passes from 1st Corps control to 9th Corps as well, and ROK 6th Division and the 28th Brigade are attached to it. Okay, I've said a lot about lines and deployments, but how do they actually work out? 25th Division, on the right of 1st Corps, has some trouble. Some Chinese groups have gotten behind 27th Infantry, and when 35th Infantry helps them disengage, the Chinese follow them and attack. So they don't break away until the afternoon. Division Commander Joe Bradley puts the Turkish Brigade between the phase line and the Golden Line, and the 24th Infantry behind Golden. ROK 1st Corps has it tough as well. They're under continuous pressure until the late afternoon, but it calms down enough then so they can disengage. But doing that under fire is really hard. The Communist forces do not follow them though, and Division Commander Kang Moon-bong gets his guys back to the second phase line and deploys 11th, 15th, and 12th Regiments west to east. That night, the Chinese and North Koreans do not attack 1st Corps, but Milburn still expects them soon to do so, so on the 28th, he orders to fall back to the Golden Line. This creates a chain reaction for everyone else moving to the no-name line. He is falling back pretty close to Seoul. However, from the outset of the enemy offensive, General Van Fleet had believed that a strong effort should be made to retain possession of Seoul, other than only to gain the tactical advantage in maintaining a foothold above the Han River, but also to prevent psychological damage to the Korean people. To give up the ROK capital a third time, he believed, would ruin the spirit of the nation. So he's been loath to allow 8th Army to make any deep withdrawals. And although the collapse of ROK 6th Division last week spoiled his plans for defending on the Kansas line, the no-name line is specifically sketched out so that a successful defense of the Pukan corridor would allow him to hold Seoul. But even if it falls, it could be a springboard to taking it back. Further east, the enemy attacks have had zero momentum the past few days by now, so it involves voluntarily giving up some ground, but that's okay. By the 28th, Van Fleet thinks that's maybe also happening in the west, so he tells his commanders in no uncertain terms to hold the no-name line and make an active defense with artillery and armored counterattacks. Still, when 1st Corps withdraws that day, the enemy is there. North Koreans are massing near Kimpo Airfield just across the Han, and it looks like they plan to cross, but Cruiser Toledo pounds them from just off Incheon, and they withdraw. 7th Cavalry is hit below Uijeongbu, but they beat back the assault, and 25th Division meets a few enemy patrols, but that's really it for the day. ROK 1st Division is at Golden already mid-morning. 1st Cavalry Division is soon in place between routes 1 and 3. 3rd Division goes to Seoul and into the reserve. Seoul is well defended by day's end, actually. 6 regiments are on the line, and 6 more are in and around the city. And below it are the 29th Independent Infantry Brigade and the Turkish Brigade. So 1st Corps is in stronger positions than any they've held since the Chinese offensive began. They're also getting concrete evidence that the offensive is weakening. POWs have only 1 day's rations on them, and interrogations tell them the Chinese supply system has collapsed under the relentless aerial attacks, so neither food nor artillery can easily get forward. But if they're not really able to continue the attacks, they are still willing. And around midnight the 28th, ROK 1st Corps comes under fire again. But heavy defensive fire, especially once again from cruiser Toledo, breaks up the assault lines. As it turns out, that's the only even semi-serious attempt so far to break the Golden Line. On the 29th, aerial recon spots a large enemy buildup opposite 25th Division, but artillery and airstrikes breaks it up after dark. UN patrols in there the 30th find 1,000 enemy dead. Other patrols that day go as far as 10 kilometers above the line and make only minor contact. Milburn reports to Van Fleet that they're staying out of artillery range while they regroup to attack again. But what they're actually doing is starting to withdraw. So 8th Army has, since the 22nd, given up like 50 kilometers of territory in the west and like 30 in the east. Logistical planning completed in anticipation of the enemy offensive kept line units well furnished with all classes of supplies during the attacks, and at the same time had prevented any loss of stocks stored in major supply points during the withdrawal. Gearing removal operations to the phased rearward movements, service forces had shifted supplies and equipment southward to predetermined locations from which line units could be readily supplied without risking the loss of supply points to advancing enemy forces. Casualties for U.S. Army divisions are about half what they were for the same time period when the Chinese attacked in November. For April 22nd to 29th, they list 314 killed and 1,600 wounded. That's just U.S. Army divisions. I don't know the ROK casualties, but the other UN fighting forces take a dozen or two casualties each, except for the British, of course, who lost over 600 men from the Gloucesters last week. As for the Chinese and North Koreans, 8th Army Headquarters lists 13,349 known enemy dead, but estimates the total at 23,829. They took 246 prisoners. In Tokyo, at UN Command Headquarters, they estimate between 70 and 80,000 total enemy killed and wounded. You cannot really verify either of these estimates, but the communist forces, in any case, took huge losses, many, many times that of the UN forces. Still, on May 1st, Van Fleet warns the enemy has plenty of men left to attack with. UN Commander Matt Ridgway's office estimates 300,000 or so currently in position to attack, mainly in the center, but 542,000 Chinese overall in the Korean Peninsula, and just under 200,000 North Koreans. He's getting ready for them to try again too, ordering all of the no-name line fortified like the Golden Line is near Seoul. Log bunkers, sandbag bunkers, huge belts of barbed wire, minefields, barrels of napalm and gasoline rigged for detonation. He also, on the 4th, shifts most of his strength and all U.S. armies to the west and central areas, so that 1st, 9th, and 10th Corps can run the defenses of the Uijiangbu-Seoul, Pukan River, and Chungcheon-Hongcheon corridors of attack, where he thinks it's going to come from. He's not overly worried about the east, where the terrain and the weakness of the KPA forces should allow the ROK forces to hold. But where is the enemy? Patrols find virtually none of them, so even as no-name line is being fortified, east of Route 24, they're also to advance to the Missouri line, like 20 kilometers north, starting tomorrow the 7th. On May the 4th, ROK 1st Division tries to establish a patrol base up Route 1, and KPA 8th Division stops that. So Van Fleet knows they are at least still out there. But that's it. The week ends with everything once again quiet on the front lines. It is anything but quiet back in the States, though. Back on April 19th, Douglas MacArthur gave his farewell address to Congress after being dismissed from UN command by President Harry Truman. And the fallout after that, I did not have time to go over last week with all the fighting in the field, so I will do so now. By the indices of public acclaim, MacArthur moved through the next days with a grandeur of a Robert E. Lee or a Blackjack Pershing. For a nation tired of a can't-win war and confused about what Harry Truman was trying to accomplish halfway around the world, MacArthur's speech offered what seemed at first blush to be a splendid alternative, a call for restoration of American grandeur and might, even be it at national risk. MacArthur stood also in vivid contrast with Truman, a soldier of heroic proportion versus a man still considered an accidental president by many Americans. Phonograph recordings of the speech are flying off the shelves, and MacArthur's parade route in an open limo through New York goes from the Battery to Midtown and back in front of an estimated 7.5 million people, which is twice the size of the crowd that watched Eisenhower's parade in 1945. After this, MacArthur sets up shop in Suite 37A of the Waldorf Astoria to prepare for his Senate hearings. They are going to be against a hostile Democrat majority. But MacArthur feels he's ready. Starting already in January, he had guys putting together documents that dealt with his differences with the JCS, perhaps preparing for a showdown with Truman where he'd have to defend himself. By now, he has 21 military footlockers full of such documents. By late April, the visitors reported, MacArthur had hit upon his strategy for the hearings. He would not make any formal statement. He would appear empty-handed and offer to answer questions. MacArthur was too shrewd to make a frontal attack on the president or on the Joint Chiefs. He would strike for the administration's weak point, Dean Acheson. MacArthur told any number of Republican senators, including those who would sit on the committee, that he would make Acheson his major target. There is the question of how far his Republican sponsors will go in supporting his positions, since there are discrepancies all over the place. I mean, Republicans very loudly condemned Truman for sending troops to Korea at all, but MacArthur keeps saying they didn't send enough. I'll quote Golden again. Any Republican who made a sober analysis of what MacArthur advocated and how sharply his proposals differed from the Midwestern isolationists then in the mainstream of their party would find ample grounds for reconsideration. And public opinion has shifted a little the past 2 weeks. There has been, and still is, a flood of telegrams and letters to the White House. But before, it was against MacArthur's firing 2-1. And now it's about 50-50. In fact, through tomorrow the 7th, the White House gets 84,097 such missives, 46,389 against, 37,708 for. So 55 to 45% roughly. But the White House considers this a wash, since people tend to write such letters when they're angry, not just supportive. But Truman knows that the hearings, which will take weeks, are a political fight, and he will have to defend his administration's policy in all areas. Those hearings begin this week on May 3rd. They are in the Senate caucus room, which is room 318 of the Senate office building. Nearly the entire Senate is present, and loads of their aides, and of course the press, though this is not being broadcast live in the interests of national security. That the public and press were excluded from the hearing room irritated MacArthur, for he wanted the widest possible audience to document that he had not been a disloyal soldier, the slur of the detested Harry Truman and the liberal press, and to force the administration, through the sheer power of his testimony, to acknowledge that he was right and change its policy on Korea. MacArthur is sworn in and says that no, he has no prepared statement, and then he dazzles the room. You gotta remember, with a great deal of knowledge on a wide variety of subjects in his head, he's a good speaker, engaging and concise, and he knocks the easy questions out of the ballpark. Things like, could the Soviets take Japan with an aerial and naval assault? No, they don't have the logistics for a sustained aerial assault. Not possible. He then gripes his familiar gripes, that he was always asking for more troops than he got, and that his air and naval forces were not efficient because they weren't allowed to hit the enemy where he musters. Okay, but then Senator Richard Russell, chairing the hearings, asks him about the specific recommendations he made to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And MacArthur talks about their January 12th list of options, which were all about widening the war into a general war with China in order to end it, or win it, right? Now, as we have seen, the JCS only considered these options as possible contingencies if, and only if, the Chinese launched an all-out assault and aerial assault, right? The list was crucial to MacArthur's case. He had constantly maintained that he and the JCS were in accord on broad military action. The January 12th list was the trump card he had displayed in his congressional speech as evidence that his strategy was not the harebrained scheme of a single general, but the considered judgment of a military hierarchy. But here, he is very, very much wrong, and provably wrong. He says that the position of the JCS and my own, so far as I know, are practically identical. He goes further and says that it's not the chief's fault for not executing these recommendations. Oh, no. It is Secretary of Defense George Marshall's. Well, his or Truman's. This actually makes the headlines after day one that Marshall vetoed the JCS. This is completely untrue. MacArthur is asked about his statement at the Wake Island Conference last October that the Chinese would absolutely not join the war. He spreads the blame around for that, which is not really wrong. However, he did say unequivocally at Wake that the Chinese would not dare enter the war. But when asked about it after it had happened, he denied categorically ever saying that, which the New York Times ran last week. If it was not nearly enough to cripple the growing assault on the White House, then anyone knowledgeable about how things like this played out in Washington now had reason to wonder just how well the general and his record would fare in Senate hearings. When asked about splitting 8th Army and 10th Corps last fall, which led to disaster at Chosin Reservoir, he says, actually, the troop deployment could not have been better, even had he known the Chinese were there in force. He says the problem was the restrictions on American air power. The Chinese had been allowed to concentrate on the Yalu River in China, and if he'd bombed them there, they never would have crossed. Russell says, wait, you mean you wanted to bomb the Chinese in China before they'd made any moves whatsoever into Korea? Which would start outright war with China. MacArthur says he would have warned China first that any intervention would have been a cause for war. This is rewriting history. No one in Washington had ever denied him permission to do something that he had never requested permission to do. That's not possible by default. He also defends his Home by Christmas offensive, which was a disaster, by saying even if he'd known the Chinese were there, he would not have changed anything, which is a lie. During a short break, MacArthur says he hopes this won't take much longer since he has an appointment later. And everyone's shocked that he seems to think you can cover the whole Korean War in one day. Senator Wayne Morse says just his cross-examination is going to take 3 hours at least. Russell agrees and says to MacArthur, as much as we dislike to inconvenience you in any way, I know that you will give this committee time to really develop this matter. MacArthur does not argue, and nor will I. For though this is only the middle of the first day of the hearings, this week is done because I need more time to really develop this matter, so I will pick it up next week. I'll end today with what might be foreshadowing for the next few days of the hearings. A quote from David Halberstam's The Coldest Winter. One of the great problems with Douglas MacArthur, something that had bedeviled those who dealt with him for years, was that he did not always tell the truth. He used the truth when it suited him and his causes, and readily departed from it when it got in his way. Because he was surrounded by so many sycophants, and no one ever challenged him, his own distortions eventually became crystallized as truth. Challenges to his vision quickly became seen as the distortions of sworn enemies. When he had spoken before Congress, he had lied shamelessly about one critical point. He had claimed the Joint Chiefs supported his positions. Perhaps he had convinced himself that they did. Perhaps, in his own mind, he who had gloried in mocking and belittling them now truly believed they had indeed supported him. That, in the end, if it came down to a collision between the military and civilian politicians, then like it or not, all military men would back him up. Though he had not necessarily been loyal to them in the past, they would nonetheless be loyal to him now. Well, we shall see soon enough what the Joint Chiefs have to say. We are able to bring you this coverage thanks to the Time Ghost Army. That is what allows us to make all of our productions. And you too can join the Army at timeghost.tv or patreon.com. And Edward Harding, is the Army Member of the Week. Do not forget to subscribe, and do not forget to check out my baseball history podcast, and see you next time.